Welcome, everybody. Today's show is called How to Control Your Fear, and I'm joined here with Dr. Amy Silver. Amy is a clinical psychologist. She's published in dozens of journals and magazines. She's been a contributing author for a number of books. She's written a few herself: Conversations Create Growth, Brace for Impact, and her newest book, which we'll be chatting about today, which is called The Loudest Guest, How to Control Your Fear. While you're listening, if you'd like to check out her books and her work, you can find her online at dramysilver.com. Amy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So in an ideal world, fear is adaptive, right? It's not this random thing that just plagues us. It actually serves the purpose. But for many of us, fear stops being adaptive and starts being maladaptive. It keeps us from the things we need and want to do. How do you know when you've crossed that line? You know, being afraid to run across a freeway, that's a adaptive fear. That's your inherited genetic intelligence. But being afraid to, knock on the door of a friend or go out in a social gathering, obviously that's maladaptive. How do people know when fear has started to have sort of a destructive impact in their lives?
That's such a fascinating question, and one that I think is our role as a human to try and find that line. I think there are things which we feel in control of. We feel that we are in control of our fear. And then when we spend more time with it or we look towards it, we see that actually fear is controlling us and not in, as you say, a helpful way. I think it's a lifelong journey of looking at this. And the brilliant thing about fear is that it can be a beautiful signpost to us of a way to go. And if we keep our eye on it, it's this beautiful guide that gets us to stretch and grow. But if we allow it to overtake us and choose the direction for us, we do start to limit our lives. And this balance requires us to develop a clearer relationship with our fear so that we can actually talk to it and decide together with our fear voice. Are you guiding me? Are you commentating? Or are you controlling?
One thing I can never figure out is how we're so different, just hardwired. I remember when I was a teenager, I would go body surfing in Southern California with a friend of mine named Chris. And we would go to this beach that just huge waves right on the sand, and he would just get pummeled. And he just seemed to have no, and obviously surfing is not life, but they're similar in different ways. And I'll give you a more real life example. This morning, I was walking my middle son, my 9-year-old, to school, and he says, "Oh, Dad, I need a pencil." And he jumps into a store, looks the store owner right in the eye and says, "Hello, I need 2 pencils, please." And, he's 9, I'm 43. I would still sort of hum and haw and mumble and look around the store. It's just like, he's born with it. He's just born with it. He'll walk into a shop. He'll speak to anybody. Am I afraid of the store owner? No, but some of this, of course, is just introversion, extroversion traits and things like this. But there seems to be some certain hardwiring where some people they just come out of the womb ready to strap on their cycling shoes and just bomb down the hill. And others kind of hide out in the shadows. Do you have any indication about why that is?
It's again, this understanding of our relationship with fear. So if we, for example, are aiming to be fearless before we do something, we probably wouldn't do anything. The idea of waiting to be okay before we do something is something that can be really trapping for us. And I think some people just learn how to override their fear voice. And we're not aiming to be fearless, but we're aiming to just separate ourselves from our fear so that our actions aren't determined by our fear. And I think of it almost like a muscle. And this is where I think it relates to your work so deeply. It's about persistence and growing that muscle by taking increasingly difficult steps to master this thing that we are living in. And sometimes that's the muscle of not listening to our fear voice. And what I find astounding is that people say, "Oh, that person's so courageous," or "that person, I wish I could do that thing." And yet we have this kind of spectrum of areas of our lives in which we are courageous. So there'll be people who are physically courageous, but maybe not so courageous in being vulnerable with their feelings.
Yep.
Or we have the courage to have really difficult conversations, but not the courage to stand up and do a presentation. So there are all these different types of courage, and you identified several of them in the introduction about, your health worries, your financial worries, your career worries, your family worries, all these different worries and fears that we have. And this muscle of courage is something that we need to practice in all of those areas. And some of us have got really good in some of those areas, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to keep stretching in other areas. And that muscle is something that we can use in one area that we've learned somewhere else. So
So
yeah, I think
for over a year now, it's been a really weird time. We were just chatting before we started about COVID and lockdown, and people react so differently. I have friends and colleagues who literally have barely left the house in over a year. And then I have other people who didn't really follow any guidelines, lockdown, whatever. Some of them have radical political views, but most of them just have a very different reaction to the situation. It's been a really interesting thing to observe because it has affected everyone. Give you a couple of examples. In the grocery store, everybody wears a mask, but there are people in the forest right now hiking alone with their dog wearing a mask. And so again, when we chat about like trying to find the line between where fear is rational and irrational, a random person hiking alone with their dog in the woods wearing a mask, that seems pretty irrational. And so again, what have you seen in the past year with COVID that's been interesting as somebody who researches and works with fear that has perhaps something people should be thinking about?
You're right. It has been an incredible year to spot the difference. We've all been in the same experience, and yet our reactions to them have been so different, and our experiences through them have been different. What is interesting is how that is tying in with our habits and the decisions that we've made about our habits. Often fear comes from a position of when we feel like our values have been challenged in some way. So I think some of the reactions that people are having is because this touches on their values, something really quite deep, and it challenges them, and therefore they have a really strong reaction to it that ties in with keeping that fear abated, with their values being challenged. But it becomes a habit, and I think that's the bit that we all need to be thinking about now, is what habits have we set up over the last year, regardless of which end of that spectrum we're on. What habits have we developed that now we need to adjust, because now we're emerging together as a collective with all of those different spectrums that could really divide us even further than we are already, because fear is really divisive. If we were kind of talking about, us as a society, I think we really need to figure out a way that we don't let fear increase the divisions between us. And I think that's the opportunity that we have coming out of this, is we've got closer to our individual fears and what we do and how we react. And now we need to work hard to move into a compassionate space where we understand that there may have been different positions, there may have been different experiences, there may have been different habits, and our habits may also need to be adjusted accordingly as we emerge as a tribe together.
You said it butts up against people's values. What are some of the values that perhaps were challenged for people?
And COVID, I think a lot of it was, the values around freedom and rights. And
Right.
I think
Civil
it was
liberties.
about
Yeah.
the values of safety and being vulnerable. I don't think many people, I think one of the things that I spend a lot of time talking about in my work is the idea that we've always been vulnerable. It's just we understand that on a much deeper level now. We've had this experience. So it's almost like we have been challenged with that knowledge. We have a closer understanding of how transient potentially our lives are, and how, and so that obviously really challenges our sense of self and our sense of community and our sense of what we're here for. And all of those things provide a challenge for our brains, because it requires a bit of dealing with uncertainty or inflexibility or lack of control or big things that we really just hadn't thought about before. And so those challenges are interpreted by our brains as fear. I mean, all fear is a story that our brain is telling us that's related to a physical response to something. So something happens in our environment or in our brains, and we get sent a signal from our body to get ready. And the reason that we get ready is to be prepared for whatever this thing is. But it doesn't actually send us a story about whether we need to get prepared in an excited way or in a nervous way. It's completely the story that we're telling ourselves that convinces us that it's fear and not excitement. So that's a fascinating tool that we have available to us, is to be able to turn this conversation inward and start to create this dialogue with our fear voice so that we can evaluate whether it is excitement that we're actually feeling and not fear. Or as some people call it, like, it's a newness. It's
New
just
energy.
new.
Yeah. There have been some things that during COVID help people face fears in a positive way. Here's a perfect example. I've been doing this crazy podcast for 9 years or something, and I just flipped on the camera last year. Why?
Mm-hmm.
I don't particularly like to look at myself for an hour, but same thing. Our company, we would do voice calls twice a day. Suddenly we all do video calls. We all just kind of got over it. This kind of camera shyness, camera fear thing. And all around the world now, even when I'm calling old friends, we flip on the camera. Kind of interesting. But on the flip side of that, I was in a social situation recently where I think there was 12 people in a room, and it was noticeably awkward for me. I'm not an extremely social person, pretty introverted. And I was like, wow, I've lost some skills here. And so, there's been some things where I've gotten much more comfortable staring at my own face and watching the aging process in real time every single day. And then there's been other things where, things that are challenging for me, like social anxiety and things like this, that have definitely regressed. How do you help people think about, I guess my concern is that this doesn't end for a lot of people, meaning a number of people who, like me, are pretty introverted. A number of people I've spoken to told me that last year was a great year and had an excuse not to go out. They didn't have to go to parties and have to meet friends. I was like, not sure if that's healthy. I'm not that extreme, but I've had a number of people tell me that last year was their best year just because they got to hide out in the house and work at home, stay in their PJs, watch Netflix, this kind of thing. Do you have any concerns about people never leaving quarantine? Like lockdown becomes the lifestyle?
I do, actually. I have to say, I think there are some serious consequences here of the rock that our normal habits have had. We have really been rocked by this, and there is a natural attrition to those skills, as you said, like in the same way that there would be if you were working a muscle group and then stopped. There would be a natural attrition. So the fact that you have got more used to putting your video camera on is because you have kept with that habit and you have now developed that habit, so it's now second nature to you. The reason that it feels more socially anxious to be in a group is because you haven't, and it's been a long time since that has happened. For those of us that do not push past those natural, understandable, completely predictable anxieties that we have, will seriously develop a habit that is much, much harder to break in the future. It is going to be much easier for us to all turn towards this awkward, uncomfortable, not particularly attractive option of pushing past these fears together, so that we do this all together. And that is why the compassion piece is so important, because we are all going to be, some people are going to be racing back to parties and events and opportunities, racing, they're desperate. The thing that we must remember and recognize and hold ourselves to account to is that there is a deliberate action here that we have to take to overcome that fear of breaking a habit that's really been quite set for us over the last year. So deliberately experimenting, and that doesn't mean that you go from not seeing anyone to going to a party. It means, okay, well, I still want to be able to walk to the post office and see people in the post office and interact with them. So, maybe that's my first step. Or maybe my first step is having a coffee with somebody. Well, what's my first step? What does this look like? And as with all behavioral experiments, you would design the steps so that each step is pushing you a little bit further into your discomfort, which, don't forget, is just you readdressing the balance with your fear. Each step is not so severe that it scares you and you pull back and you move back into comfort, because comfort is deceivingly positive in the short term and unbelievably disadvantageous if you allow that to stay as a habit.
I always think about, or I try to think about, like, what does the human organism need? And a lot of people have this idea that everything at home is better. Working from home is better. Bigger backyard is better. Suburban lifestyle, Australia, US, this kind of spreading out is better. I just don't see any evidence of that in human history. The agrarian age, like these poor farmers lived alone because they had to. Like if you look at
Mm-hmm.
the way, whether you're looking at like Mesopotamia or Greece, or like people just they just smash all over each other. And the cultural hubs of the world are just people just flopped on top of each other. And that includes the introverts like me. I just think it's human nature. And I think there's this huge move, like in the US right now, there's this huge exodus from New York City and San Francisco, and people are moving to suburban America. It's like, I don't think that's going to last. I think that'll be a 2-year stint, and people will just realize, like, the human organism, no matter what you think about it, like Netflix and work from home, it's not enough. It's just not enough. Like you said, you need to go to the post office and bump into somebody. I don't know why, but we do. We're extremely tribal, extremely social people, and fighting that just seems like a really bad idea. So I've seen a lot of people sort of bubble off, get bigger homes, isolate more, set up home theaters. I don't see any evidence that that's going to work long term. That just seems like a recipe for mental health problems. And where I grew up in the U.S., mental health is just a disaster. Something like 1 in 5 people have anxiety or depression or something worse. And I think a big part of it is they look out their window and there's nobody around. They just have this giant garage and this huge yard, and it's all beautiful and everything's temperature controlled, and they're just lonely as hell. And they just don't realize it. But if you just open up like a history book and just roll back like 100 years, I mean, ridiculous. Even like when like the western part of my country was settled, these people just flopped on top of each other. They built these literally flop houses. They have all the land in the world. They just build this house and just flop on top of each other. Why? It's like, so this is my concern, is that people have done these kind of like forward thinking futuristic moves. I just don't think they work. There's this axiom that the more digital the world becomes, the more tribal it becomes. And whether it's radical political groups or crazy fringe stuff online, you see this hardcore tribal nature where people are just sticking their stake in the ground and saying, like, Doge to the moon or alt-right or whatever craziness they come up with. It seems like very much a reaction to the fact that we haven't bumped into anybody at the grocery store in a while. We haven't, like, I don't know, had an argument with somebody about their dog peeing on the tree or whatever it is. I just think that, like, denying human nature, I think fighting human nature is just like, it's going to be a losing battle. I'm not sure what your thoughts are.
I agree. I agree completely. I think unfortunately the technology world allows us to surround ourselves with what we think are like-minded people. And so that means, just through the algorithms and then our choices on top of it, I think that we are missing the diversity of what it is to be okay and tolerate each other's views. It is okay to have different views, both sides aired. It is okay to disagree and to have a really constructive conversation. I think we're losing that tolerance of being able to do that. And I think loneliness is really clearly a precursor for depression, and and not checking your thoughts against other people's reality. So I think it's all very dangerous to allow for that separateness. And I think, just to go back to your comment about it's a human need. It's a human need because humans couldn't survive without each other. There is, an anthropological reason why we are together, and there is a biological reason why we need each other. We have a system that prevents us from being too badly hurt.
Mm.
That's the pain system. It kind of identifies that there's a danger for us physically, and so it kind of tells us and warns us using pain. The same is true for social pain and being rejected or being excluded or ridiculed, because the need for us to be accepted by the tribe is so strong. It's
Mm.
life and death. We would not survive without an adult around us. If we were when we were born, we just cannot do it. It's actually a dependency. And so
Yeah.
as long as we remember that actually we are animals, I think we would do so much better. We are animals. We are guided by these primitive um, sections of our brain that are tying us to each other, but also the primitive parts of our brain which signal this fight and flight response. We are threat-seeking machines. That's kind of what our animalistic brain is doing.
Right.
And yes, we've got this really uber clever outside of our brain, which is capable of incredible communication and deep, deep thinking and innovation and creation. But we are still being run on this primitive part of our brain. And until we get that, I think we put ourselves in a lot of danger. And part of that is listening too much to our emotions,
Mm.
when actually we should be listening to what we want in life, and how to make deep, trusting connections with each other.
In relationships, whether it's getting into one or getting out of one, what have you seen as a psychologist in terms of fear keeping people stuck?
Fear keeps us stuck all the time. We have the fear of getting this decision wrong. The fear of being on our own, the fear of not being loved, not being valued, not having a role. There is so much fear around us that's this fear voice. Like this book that I've just written is called The Loudest Guest, because this voice in our head just is so loud that it actually prevents us from making choices.
Yeah.
Even when we know that the relationship is unhealthy, it's still this fear voice saying, yes, but, life will be worse on the other side if you have this very dominant fear voice, this loudest guest in our mind, it will absolutely make it hard for you to put yourself in an unknown situation. And the way that it does that is by telling you to stay. So that's what it's doing when it stops us. When we start a relationship, we have all the fears that this won't be reciprocated, that I'm putting myself out there and I'm going to fail, that if they know the real me, they're going to leave me. And there's all this kind of hiding stuff that goes on, and doubt about showing this true part of ourselves, which is all these layers that get added on as humans, where we think that the other person can't see the real us and still like us.
Mm.
And so we have this whole imposter syndrome piece, which is again directed by our fear voice. So it gets involved everywhere in relationships. This voice tells us what to say, when to say it, who to talk to, who not to talk to, how to look, what to laugh at, what not to laugh at. It's just literally there the whole time, guiding us, and sometimes controlling us. And then we do what the fear voice tells us to do, rather than thinking, what do I want?
Mm.
And I think, again, that's the key for all of us, is to turn to the fear voice, have a conversation and say, I understand what you're warning me about. I get it. I understand why this might be a dangerous situation. And let me evaluate this. What are the risks? Do I want to take on what you're telling me to do? What will happen if I do take on what you tell me? Is it time for me to stretch that muscle? Could I learn something here? Is there more belief that I could have in myself? The interesting thing, a lot of people talk about confidence, and the funny thing is that people wait to be confident to then make a decision to do something that's courageous. Whereas in fact, it happens on the other side of you doing it. So you do something and then you feel confident.
Mm.
So waiting for this sensation of being at peace with a difficult decision is actually not the right thing to do. You won't ever get there. You won't
Yeah.
ever feel good until you know what's on the other side.
I guess what happens is people will push back, and by people I mean me. They'll say, I'm afraid I'll pick the wrong person, and usually, or I'm afraid I won't be loved, or I won't love, and usually there's a fair amount of truth there, right? We almost all pick the wrong person. We almost all misstep. We almost all. I mean, you can't get through life without your heart broken. You can't get through life without falling on your face, and so it's not that we're just irrationally, again, coming back to this adaptive maladaptives, these are very real fears. There's a very, very high likelihood that it's not going to work out. There's a very high likelihood that you'll choose the wrong person. All of those fears, there's a certain amount of justification. And I think this is where people really struggle. I was chatting with a friend of mine recently, and he lost his wife, and he's obviously he wants to have kids and have a partner and this kind of thing. And his wife passed away quite prematurely. And he was saying, my biggest fear is not that I don't get married. He's like, I'm much more worried about picking the wrong person. And I didn't really have a response to that, because I think that's a real fear, in his mind, he spent a lot of time picking the right partner. He was extremely happy with his wife, and I don't know what to say to that. Again, I come back to this thing. When is it adaptive? When is it maladaptive? It's really hard to find a partner. He found one. They got married. They were en route to build a family. And, she passed. How do you help? Again, it's one of those situations where it's not that this fear conversation is just a neurotic middle-aged man. This is like this is a very rational internal struggle that, he's trying to make the best of his life.
And I think there is no right answer here. I mean, obviously, but I think that, even that conversation of you want this to be the right person, well, that does evoke a lot of fear. Whereas if you were to say, I want to find a person, then you don't have as much fear. So it may not be that one's right and one's wrong. It just may be that one is a more useful belief than the other. And setting up as there being right versions and wrong versions is always going to feel really, really fearful. And of course, why would you take a road towards a bad option? But just like your friend who goes on the waves, there are bad things that can happen. But I bet he doesn't walk out and kind of go, bad things could happen. Or he has a certain amount of that in order to keep him safe, as safe as he can be. But the joy is in the fact that you actually don't know. And I feel that something that I've been thinking about a lot recently is that I actually feel that fear is a source of life. It's this kind of that edge that you were talking about. When is it adaptive? When isn't it? Is a sort of an exciting moment of spirit and life, and a moment of risk. And if we channel that as the journey rather than there being a right and wrong, we may feel it's a different ride.
Yeah. Great conversation, Amy. For people who want to pick up your book, follow you online, tell people where to find you.
Oh, the book, The Loudest Guest, How to Change and Control Your Relationship with Fear, is available on Amazon and everywhere, anywhere, all bookshops, online. And I'm on dramysilver.com. Oh, and also, I'm also, sorry, I should say I'm also on all the socials. So Instagram, Facebook, and we run a courage club. So if anybody's interested in doing a courage boot camp, you can find out about that there.
Amy, thanks so much for coming on the show, and let's keep in touch.
Thanks, Lucas.